Hi friends, welcome back to my channel, or welcome to my channel if you're new. Today I'm going to show you how I use the whip stitch to connect granny squares together. This is what I use whenever I'm making my book sleeves. I like to whip stitch them together. I like the way that it gives a nice flat seam to these granny squares. The whip stitch might seem a little bit intimidating to some, but I promise it is fairly simple, so I'm going to show you how to do that today. So let me show you what you're going to need. So for the materials that you will need your granny squares. I'm just going to show you how I connect two granny squares together, but however many you need, it's going to be the same way for all of them. You will need a tapestry needle, a pair of scissors, the yarn that you're going to want to connect your granny squares together. I'm choosing to use the same color as this final row of my granny squares. And then optional, if you are struggling with keeping your granny squares together in the way that you will want some stitch markers. These ones are from Hobby and they're little hearts and they're super cute. But let's go ahead and get started. To start your whip stitch for your granny squares, you are going to first need a long piece of yarn. I tend to go a little bit longer than I probably need, just to be sure, but go ahead and grab a long piece of yarn, and you're going to just cut that off from your skein. Once you have your piece of yarn ready to go, we're going to go ahead and attach it to our tapestry needle. I just wrap mine around, make a little loop, and then push that loop through the eye of the needle. So now you are ready to go for your whip stitch. When you've finished connecting with a whip stitch, you're going to have a nice little seam like this. But to make sure that you get that sort of seam, there's a specific way you have to hold your granny squares. So the way that I do this is there is a right side and a wrong side to a granny square. As long as you do it the same way around, this will be the right side. You can see that the stitches are a little bit more defined. And then when you flip it over, you can tell that they look a little bit more bumpy. They don't look as defined as they do on the other side. It just looks like the back of a project. So we are going to make sure that we have the right sides facing up for both of our granny squares. So what does that mean? That means that I'm going to make sure that both of the sides that are the right side, so these are the right sides of these, you can see that's the wrong side. We're going to have the right sides facing out. So that means I will place wrong sides together. So now you can see when I hold them both together, I have right side facing up, and again, right side facing up, but they are together. And you can see that both of the wrong sides are touching. That is how I get that nice seam that I showed you. And so this is how we are going to be holding our piece. Now that you have your piece held together correctly, you have the wrong sides facing each other with the right sides facing out on both sides. We're going to attach our yarn to the piece. And we're going to go ahead and start in the very corner. Doesn't matter which corner, I'm going to start on this corner just to attach, and then I'll show you where I go from there. So if you have followed any of my granny square tutorials, you'll know that the way that I make my granny square corners is I have 3 double crochet, a chain 2, and then 3 double crochet in every corner. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to find my chain 2, so you can see there's chain 1 and chain 2. And when you look at a stitch, there are 2 loops on each stitch. So we have 1 loop here and then 1 loop here that make a V. We are going to place our needle we're just working into the first granny square here. We're going to place our needle into the back loop of the first chain. So we have 1 chain here, 1 chain here, and then double crochets. So we're going to go into the back loop of this first chain. Which one is the back loop? It's the one that is in the back, just like it's called. So this one right here. The one that's right here is the front loop, and we will not be working into that one. So we're going to grab the back loop of that first chain, and we're just going to pull our yarn through. We don't want to pull it through all the way though, so I left a little bit of a tail. And now we need to connect it to our other granny square. Again, I'm keeping my granny squares wrong sides touching, so that way I make sure I have that nice seam. And we're going to do the same thing on the other side. Now, if we were holding the granny square like this, where we have our working yarn on the opposite side, it would still be the same way. This would be our second chain. So right here, that's the second chain, and then the first chain coming from this way. And then we are still going to go through the back loop. So there's the back loop, the front loop right here. We're still going to go through this back loop. The whip stitch consists of going back and forth through the back loops of stitches. Now I'm still holding my piece with my yarn on my left, and I have gone through that first stitch in the back loop only. I'm going to fold down the first granny square, and I'm going to look on my other one, and I'm going to look for the corresponding stitch right across from it. So right across from this stitch that I've gone through is one of the chains here. And if it's hard for you to see like your little V, you can just turn it a little bit towards you. And we're going to go through the back loop of that chain. So here's that back loop. I'm going through. And the way that I'm going through is away from me. So I'm going to go into that loop away from me and pull it through. At this point, I'm just going to go ahead and make a knot because I will weave that in a little bit later, or I'll just do one pull through. So now your granny squares are technically attached, at least at one spot. And now we're going to go back and forth to weave in our yarn. If you are worried about not having your piece in the right position or not having these stitches match up, what I like to do sometimes is I will take a stitch marker and I will just grab the final stitch that I will work in, which is going to be that last chain 2 in the opposite corner. So I'll just grab that back loop, and then the same thing for the other granny square. I will just place this through that back loop of the corresponding stitch, lock it in place. So now it's not going to move around too much. I'm going to be able to hold that over there and make sure that it stays together. You can also add additional ones throughout, but I'm just going to use this one to hold it together at the end. So we've done our first stitch, but now we need to connect all the rest of the stitches. So like I mentioned, the whip stitch consists of going through the back loop of 2 stitches that correspond to each other across your crocheted piece. So we've gone through our first one. Now we need to go through the second loop, or the second stitch on each granny square. So our yarn, our working yarn, is currently just kind of sitting here. Since we went away from us, we're now going to come towards us. So I'm going to find that first stitch, or the first chain out of our chain 2 on the opposite granny square from me. And we're going to do the same thing. We're going to go into that back loop. So into that back loop of the first granny square that's away from us. And then I'm going to find the matching stitch on this front granny square, which is going to be that chain 1, or part of the chain 2 right here. So I'm also going to go through the back loop, and I'm just going to pull this towards me. So now we've done those 2 chains, and now we're going to go through our regular stitches all the way to the other side. For this next stitch, we're going to be pulling our yarn away from us. So we're going to find the first stitch here, which is a double crochet. You can see, here's my V. This is the front loop, and then this is the back loop. We are always going to go through the back loop, and then I'm going to find the corresponding stitch on this side, which is again going to be that first double crochet. It might be a little bit hard to see, but you can see there's 3 double crochet here. So here's that very first stitch. And I'm going to find the back loop. So you can see front loop is on this side because this is the front of this granny square. So this one would be the back loop. So I'm going to go through the back loop on the first granny square, go through the back loop on the second one, and I'm going to pull the yarn away from me. So now we're going to repeat that same motion for the rest of the stitches. It's going to be a repeating pattern of going away from us, towards us, away from us, towards us, in the back loops of every stitch, making sure that they correspond to each other, meaning that they are right across from each other all the way across. So we just went away from us, now we're going to go towards us. So I'm going to find that next stitch that's right next to it. So you can see that this is our next stitch right here. It's right next to where we just left off. We're going to be going towards us, going to grab that back loop, and then matching it on the other side, which is going to be this stitch right here, going through just the back loop, and then pulling the yarn towards us. And when you pull it apart, you can start to see that it's taking some shape. It's looking nice and flat. We just have an extra piece here that we can weave in at the end, but the seam is looking really nice. I'll go ahead and show you a few more times just so that we are on the same page so that you can really understand how this works. We're now going to be going away from us with our yarn since we just had our yarn go towards us. We're going to go into the next stitch right after, find that back loop. You can see it's right here. Here's that front loop, but we're going to go through the back loop and then matching the stitch. Usually you can find out which stitch is right after, or it should be corresponding by going through your first stitch, and you'll almost just naturally go through the one that's right across from it. So you can see, here's my first stitch. I'm going to go through the back loop only of that next stitch and pull my yarn away from me. Making sure that you're pulling tight, but not too tight because we don't want this to bunch up. Now into the next stitch, you can see we just went through this stitch right here. We're now going to go through this next stitch, going into just the back loop. You can turn it towards you to see your stitches better. There's that first loop. We're going to ignore it, go into the back loop, naturally going into that next stitch right across from it, only in the back loop, pull the yarn towards us. And then again into the next stitch, going through the back loop, finding my corresponding stitch, going through the back loop, pulling the yarn away from me. Now you're just going to do that back and forth motion of going into the back loop of each of your two stitches all the way to the end, and I'm going to show you once I get to my chains how we are going to finish this off. All right, I've just gone through and I've attached all of my stitches together except for these very last ones. So the last stitches that I have are the two chains in the corner on both sides. I'm going to remove my stitch marker so that I can show you this better. And sometimes it can be a little bit hard to see at this point. So what I like to do is I'm going to open my granny squares up and we're going to look at it like this. So you can still see you have your two chains in the corner on your first stitch here, or on your first granny square. There's your chain 1, chain 2. And then same thing goes for the other granny square. You can see that this is your chain 1 and then chain 2. And it's going to be the same way where we are going to go through the back loops of the matching chains on each side. So since I had the yarn going away from me, I'm going to have the yarn coming towards me. And I'm going to find that first chain, which you can see right here. Here's that first chain. Sometimes you might need to roll it towards yourself so you can fully see it. We've got a front loop, which is right here, and the back loop right here. And the back loop is the one that we want. So we're going to go through that back loop and then find the chain on our other one, which is going to be right here. It's a little bit hard to see, but we're going to go through the back loop of that one, just the same, pulling the yarn towards me. And then we have just one more stitch. And this one I probably will do laying flat, just so I can fully see it. So we have our final chain right here, with the corresponding one being right here. So I just pulled my yarn towards me. I'm still going to have my yarn go away from me. But since this is our final stitch, we're also going to do it twice. So I'm going to, again, look for the back loop. You can see that there's the V right here. We're going to go through that back loop on our first one. And then we're going to look at the V on our other one and go through the back loop on this one as well. So I'm going to go ahead and make sure I pull this away. And that has basically finished your seam, but we need to secure it still. So I'm going to go through and I'm going to have my yarn go away from me again. So I'm going to go through that same 2 stitches that I've just went through. I'm going to pull through, not all the way, to make a loop. And then I'm just going to finish that loop into a knot. And then once you've done that, go ahead and weave in both of your ends and you have finished your whip stitch. So now once you've woven in all of your ends, your piece is now connected with this really nice flat seam. I love the way that this seam looks for granny squares. I just think it looks so nice, especially for my book sleeves. And then obviously when you go to block your piece, it will lay a lot more flat. But this is my favorite way to connect these. There are a ton of different ways. You can also do single crochets along it or slip stitches. You can really do whatever you want, but this is just my favorite way to connect them. And then you can see this is what the opposite side looks like. That's where it kind of has more of a seam, but on the front side, it's nice and flat. But I hope that this really helped you guys and that you enjoyed it. Let me know your thoughts down below and what your favorite way of connecting your pieces together are. Whip stitch is definitely my favorite one, so I hope that you guys enjoyed. Definitely make sure to like this video if you liked it, dislike it if you disliked it, and subscribe if you haven't already, but I will see you guys in the next one. Bye everyone.